Is the Dominican Republic the Silicon Valley of startup culture? For nearly a decade, the Dominican Republic has been laying the groundwork for a thriving startup ecosystem, but is it ready for global exposure? In this video, I'm going to be talking about the underlying factors that I see as a startup guy in terms of the ability for Dominican Republic to grow, the ability for it to scale, and the ability for it to position itself as a global leader in the startup ecosystem and startup technology. There are a couple of things missing from the startup ecosystem. Number one is going to be modern startup acceleration, incubation, and programming. One of the things that I observed working in the Dominican Republic with the startup ecosystem is that a lot of the accelerator programming is outdated. Unfortunately, many of the mentors, although they're experts in their field, they lack the real world knowledge that comes with being a startup founder, vendor, or operator. Number two is actually a cultural piece that I said, and I might get in a lot of trouble for this, but it's really nepotism. There are a lot of family dynasties, not only in Dominican Republic, but across Latin America, that tend to concentrate power, influence, resources, introductions, and networks among themselves, rather than allowing international players or even, let's say, mid-level consultants, partnerships, thought leaders into the game. Might be because of a language barrier, but I have my doubts about that. It's really more about who's taking center stage on driving the projects. Number three is a startup ecosystem per se, which consists of 5 pillars. One of the pillars is support for entrepreneurs, very different from small business owners, very different from executives. Number two is the legal and government framework. Although there are government programs, they're not very well promoted. And although there are government incentives, they're not very well understood. Number three is university and talent. Universities and talents, although there has been a big push for the past decade in terms of developing technical talent, that really amounts to a lot of cybersecurity professionals and programmers versus startup entrepreneurs that are really scrappy. Number four is the financial system. There are 2 kinds of financial products that banks usually give out. It's either equity-based financing or debt-based financing. Debt-based financing works really, really well for small businesses, but not necessarily for startups who need large capital and runway to innovate, develop their research, test their market, develop their MVP, all of the programming and developing the coding that goes into that. And in addition, finding the talent gaps that they need to really deploy. And the fifth one, and I think the most important one that's missing, is corporate involvement. While firms in the US like Google or Amazon typically have their own internal innovation centers where they incentivize their own staff, who, by the way, are closest to the day-to-day operations and closest to the little problems that they can tweak within their industry to get better, most of the large corporations, with a few very notable exceptions, do not invest directly in corporate innovation programs led by smaller startup vendors. Everybody knows what Silicon Valley is, but a couple of years ago, the president of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader, has called for the construction of Silicon Beach in the Dominican Republic. Let's talk about it. So he definitely laid out where it was going to be in a big press release. It's in the Puerto Plata region up on the north side. The real estate itself has been identified, but to date, it hasn't really materialized. But the concept is there, and you can tell that there's a lot of intent behind it because it was a very public announcement. So he wants to make public and private alliances. He wants to create co-working spaces. He wants to create a hub and a culture very similar to Silicon Valley and Atlanta and New York City and London, and even in Australia, Japan are great examples of they really build a small live, work, play environment that's conducive to startups. Is the Dominican Republic on its way to becoming an international innovation hub for innovation and entrepreneurship, or is something still missing? I think that there are some pieces that are missing, but some pieces are there. If it's one thing that the Dominican Republic does not lack is capital, although most of the capital in this country is directed towards infrastructure projects, tourism projects, finance projects, real estate projects. There hasn't been an overwhelming focus, as far as I can see, beat to the street in terms of really developing the startup sector and really innovating that piece. There's a lot of talk about, for example, the national strategy on cybersecurity, exportation of tech talent, better known as nearshoring talent because of all the geopolitics that the US and North American countries are dealing with in terms of China and trying to unplug from their dependencies on that. Well, one thing that a country can export aside from industrial goods is also talent. So Dominican Republic, for as far as what I can see, is less focused on developing net new innovation and startup talent and more focused on developing IT talent because they export a lot of talent and services. There was a really important development launched in 2022 by the Dominican government. They have a ministry called the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, MIC, and one of their subcommittees or subprojects, RD Emprende, which means Dominican Republic Does Business, was framed as a government-backed initiative to support startups. But thus far, I haven't seen a startup launch. I haven't seen a startup that's homegrown here scale to any, national level recognition. I've definitely not seen too many Dominican firms from the technology sector operate in others, although there are some notable startups in the periphery, but namely they're talent sourcing for the tech sector rather than tech innovation per se. Another really important development in Dominican Republic was Entrepreneurship Law number 655-16. It intended to create a legal framework for startups and independent entrepreneurs, although it's very little known and very little discussed. A quick Google search doesn't really turn up a lot of information. And if you talk to most entrepreneurs in the country, although it's good intentions, it hasn't really had its desired effect. So there's a conversation to be had about startup culture specifically in the Dominican Republic about the intentions and the framework and the actual outcomes. And the outcome has been, there hasn't been any unicorns coming out of the Dominican Republic. We've seen other countries build startup ecosystems from the ground up. So what lessons can we take from the global startup scene to DR to make it a reality? You got to look no further than the Asian countries. I spoke about this at some length using Japan and countries like Singapore, but I mean, even China and many of the Pacific countries. If you look into history, 100, 150 years ago, these are horse and buggy communities. They were living in huts, in sands, right? And then like 100, 150, 200 years later, they're competing on the global stage for economic dominance, political dominance, diplomatic dominance. And that didn't come from them building up their militaries, right? It came from their economic power. And where did their economic power come from? Manufacturing and technology. Just look at Singapore, look at Japan, look at China. Let's talk about gaps in the Dominican startup ecosystem. Okay, so despite the government initiatives, the Dominican Republic still hasn't produced an economy-defining tech startup. And I think that really has a lot to do with the overwhelming focus that, number one, it's a developing economy. It's the fastest growing economy in the Western Hemisphere. It's growing at a rate consistently for the past 30 years that even puts the US and Canada to shame, which is an incredible achievement and something to be really, really proud of. However, until the Dominican Republic doesn't have to focus so heavily on things like infrastructure, developing its legal system, developing its education system. I mean, common sense would tell us that those are priorities and that developing the tech ecosystem is an opportunity. Although there are a number of organizations that are, like myself, that are actively interested in bringing together the different pieces of the puzzle. Like I referenced, the 5 pillars of a startup ecosystem that really bring the Dominican startup ecosystem together. Now in Puerto Rico's home to Parallel 18, and Parallel 18 is the largest global startup accelerator in the region. They're over just an island away, and they pulled ahead, but they have big government backing, like the Puerto Rican Science Institute. They have a global network of investors. They have public support. They have a stronger education system, although not by much, that contributes talent to the local tech economy. And Puerto Rico actually has developed, if it's not directly in Puerto Rico, with their diaspora or the Puerto Ricans that are living outside of Puerto Rico, they've developed more tech entrepreneurs than the Dominican Republic has. So is it a possibility? Conditions are there. The Dominican Republic's economy is, if I'm not mistaken, already surpassed the size of Puerto Rico's economy. So why aren't we there yet? Let's talk about how enterprise and corporations affect the startup sector. So in the US, you have Google, you have Amazon, you have Uber. In the Dominican Republic, you really do have really large corporations. We're talking about the big banks like Banco Popular and Banreservas, who respectively do have their own accelerators, although they do mix and mingle small businesses with true tech startups. But then you also have really large enterprises in other sectors like Arajet and aviation, and new tech in software development and talent development. These companies don't necessarily invest in internal innovation centers, nor do they move or think like startups in the way that their corporate structure communications is concerned. For example, Arajet is one of the darlings of the business community here in the Dominican Republic. They don't have an aviation technology startup center. They don't invest in aviation technology internally, nor do they encourage innovation within the aviation sector in Dominican Republic or the region. Could they? Sure. Would they? Probably not. They're still a younger enterprise firm in the Dominican Republic, largely supported by big players like the Department of Tourism, big public support. The public is very, very proud of having a national airline. But a company like New Tech is lesser known to the broader Dominican community, and they're one of the largest tech-related firms in Dominican Republic. And I feel like those two things get mixed and mingled a lot. I'm confident that New Tech would have a better edge on starting and developing and really pushing and enabling startup culture in the Dominican Republic versus a Banco Popular or a Banreserva, who are legacy industries, legacy firms that are really tied to Dominican legacy and heritage. I feel that these younger, more nimble, agile enterprise firms here in the Dominican Republic should really be leading the charge in terms of capital, corporate investments in smaller startup technologies and their acceleration and incubation. They have professionals that are closer to the edge than those other industry professionals would be. Now, there is one really big development. In 2024, the Provoke Visibility campaign was nominated by the United Nations World Summit Awards for the Entrepreneurial Empowerment category. And what that campaign did in the Dominican Republic is it aimed to help create visibility, resources, sources of knowledge and partnership for the startup community, entrepreneurs, projects, even the students, in terms of the economic impact and outcomes that developing a startup ecosystem can really have. So the fact that that made it on the United Nations radar here in the Dominican Republic is a telling sign that not only the Dominican government, but the world government is also interested in seeing Dominican Republic develop its startup tech ecosystem. The Provoke Visibility campaign also raised awareness about top thought leaders, vendors, and resources that are available to startup vendors in the Dominican Republic for Dominican entrepreneurs who are kind of searching domestically for that kind of support. Whereas before, there's, kind of this loose subculture of entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are a hodgepodge of franchise owners, very successful small and medium-sized business owners, students with technology and startup projects, and the truest, purest form of a startup founder. The resources and community that are around that, they're all kind of commingled. Whereas, for example, in the United States or other countries, European countries, you'll have something like a federal small business administration who's focused on mom and pop Main Street businesses versus Techstars, which is based in the US, but it's a global startup tech ecosystem that's focused on building resources for technology startups. And here's the thing. You only need one Apple, one Samsung, one Toyota, one Tesla to transform an economy in the multi-billions of dollars, right? How many small businesses would Dominican Republic need in order to produce that same amount of economic revenue, economic power, economic growth, right? So although it's a lower rate of success when you invest and you build startups in the tech ecosystem, you only need one. You only need one unicorn to come out of Dominican Republic to transform the entire region in the way that large technology firms in other countries have done for them as well. So the fact that the UN nominated that kind of project in Dominican Republic out of, however many were competing for that recognition by the United Nations in Dominican Republic is telling to me that not only the entrepreneurial class in Dominican Republic is interested, but also the ruling and the government class is interested. So this really crosses class divides. In fact, that there's already a growing conversation in Dominican Republic and just across the world, I think, that entrepreneurship is the one true tool to really close class divides, economic divides, and real life family and community situations. I think that it's a really strong indication that the Dominican Republic is positioning itself to be a startup center. So recently, the Dominican Republic, as I've mentioned, is prioritizing infrastructure, cybersecurity, talent nearshoring, and these activities together, they move in the direction of building a tech economy, but not so much a startup economy. And there's a difference, right? A country like Singapore services the startup community. They export talent, they export chips, they export hardware. In the Dominican Republic, they even export like medical technology and medical devices and stuff like that, but not necessarily developing on the grounds from talent to financing to sales to growth here in the Dominican Republic, an actual startup. There are technology related and serving industries that work in the periphery, but not necessarily at the capacity or with the full support and clarity that's needed in order to really deliver a strong startup ecosystem a la Silicon Valley or New York or London. So my advice today for entrepreneurs in the Dominican Republic or entrepreneurs who want to do business from the Dominican Republic and startup is that the resources are there. They're small, they're hard to find, but they exist. And if you have a project that's interesting enough, I think that all of the basic amenities that you need are here. You may need to go outside of the Dominican Republic to get some of those resources, but we're talking startup. All those resources are digital anyway. For example, Successman operates from here, and Successman does just fine. We have business in Latin America and countries like Ecuador, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and here in the Dominican Republic, but most of our business comes from the United States. Not a big deal. However, we are actively in parallel trying to lobby and push for more involvement from big names, influencers, people with resources here in the Dominican Republic to start placing their resources in the direction of startups here. I think that one of the superpowers that Dominican Republic or any other Caribbean or Latin American country has when developing a startup is just to look at the developed economies, look at the startups that exist there and the solutions, and just give it a different name and launch here. I don't care who criticizes me for that. That's a life hack, right? If you go and you create a homegrown Uber here in the Dominican Republic that competes directly with Uber here in the Dominican Republic, but with government, private, and public sector support, then it can push Uber out. And then now you have Domino Uber here in the Dominican Republic using the same playbook as Uber there. And all of that economic growth, the tax revenues, the jobs, the infrastructure that comes along with building that tech company can come right here. I actually have my hands on a Dominican startup here in Santo Domingo who's looking to mimic one of the big success stories from the United States on a smaller scale here. And that's always been my strongest passion here in the Dominican Republic. Like make it easy. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You need to come with an idea that's already been implemented in another country, that's successful, that's going global, that's scaled, and just study their history. Just be a quick historian. Understand their pitch decks are going to be available. What's not going to be available likely is going to be the venture capital that back them. So you need to, that's one gap. What's not going to be available to you is likely the local talent that they have in their country. So you need to come through that. What's not going to be available to you are the vendors and consultants and mentors that are available to them. But this is exactly why I talk so much about the ecosystem building piece here in the Dominican Republic, because I believe that there's a general refusal to acknowledge those particular gaps. I think that acknowledging that those gaps exist and actually saying, you know what, these gaps are actually worth investing money in. Let us go and find professionals and experts who have real world knowledge to come here rather than, I partner with this big name firm here in California, big press release, a party, let's have some champagne, and then another startup still doesn't develop. I believe that closing the gaps in the entrepreneurial tech ecosystem are going to be the big game changer here in Dominican Republic. But for now, for the seasoned startup entrepreneur that's confident, that's already had an exit or has already built different startups here in the Dominican Republic, you can still build a startup and you can still scale to your first $10 or $50 million in annual recurring revenue. My name is Jonathan J. Mansour. I'm the founder and CEO of Successment, a revenue operations partner for underrepresented startups that provokes economic growth and visibility $1 million at a time by offering revenue operations under the framework of revops science. We do strategy, provision, and assets to execute your first $1 million in annual recurring revenue.